This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
The title's actually The Woman Who Changed Nixon, which is not really true, but I thought it would be interesting. She certainly did something to Nixon, which is, I think, of value. And the subtitle is the real title, Comanche Lessons in How Small Nations Can Successfully Relate to Entrenched Power. So what I'm really interested in is how little tiny nations can affect really large, or the dominant power on Earth. And what I'm trying to do is look at strategies for how power gets negotiated. That's what I'm really interested in. So I'm not really a gender person in the traditional sense, because what I'm more interested in is how power gets negotiated. So I thought I'd open with this picture, which I think is kind of emblematic of LaDonna and her cleverness, really. This is her with, who is that? You recognize?
Johnny Depp.
You recognize Johnny Depp, yes, the lovely, ever-smiling Johnny Depp, who's worth, incidentally, £350 million. And LaDonna is a key leader within a community, the Comanche. And if you, just to give you one indication of the degree of poverty of her community, Comanche County, Oklahoma in 2011 had over 20,000 people in absolute abject poverty. So you can kind of see why LaDonna would possibly want to make links and connections just on the most crass level with someone that rich. Johnny Depp, I don't know if you know, thinks he is partly Comanche, or arguably is, and I'm the last person to say who is what ethnicity and who isn't. Not least because there's a very long tradition of adoption within many tribal communities, so why shouldn't he be? Great. Although there are groups who say this is simply people making instructive use of ethnicity. So LaDonna would be using Depp to help her agenda, and Depp, who was just at this point publicising what's acknowledged to be an absolute turkey of a movie called The Lone Ranger. And actually I don't think it's that bad a film, but it does take out some of the oldest tropes and the biggest stereotypes, and he does in the movie speak in this kind of way, this guttural, monosyllabic, and that's a quote from the movie, "Do not touch rock, rock cursed." He's talking in this stereotype way, but it depends entirely how you read the movie. But still, it was not a conventional success, and certainly not in financial terms. The company responsible was Disney, and as far as I can work out, they've lost to date 125 million on this movie. So Johnny Depp helping to publicise it in any sense would be part of his contractual obligations. But in saying that, according to LaDonna, his links have been very positive and strong and good that she's been able to form. But I would argue that this is just the latest example of female Indigenous leadership making very strategic and clever choices and managing to do things that are very surprising. And I think this is just the latest example. I must say, as soon as we met, this was a topic of hilarity between us, because the whole thing is ripe with and loaded with, I suppose, ironies, that someone that rich would be reaching out to communities that are that disadvantaged, and it being done in this kind of way. It's not an uncomplex thing to happen. And just to explain to you, and if you know already or ever wonder about it, just the degree of poverty we're talking about
Americans in the United States are working to make themselves politically powerful and economically independent. Indian land has vast natural resources.
Oh dear, I've lost it now. Oh, here it is. Yeah. Okay. I'll just say something first before I press play. I just wanted to show you this. This is not about Comanche people. It's about a place called Pine Ridge in South Dakota. And you can see that Indian poverty, you know, it's here on Al Jazeera, this article, this news article. And it's Native Americans really being used to some extent as political footballs to speak against the United States, to say, look at the history of colonialism, the imperial history that's not discussed, it's not known about, and look at this abject poverty. More people should know about it. So you have things like this news article from Al Jazeera. In saying that, they're not pointing out anything that isn't true. You know, some of the poorest people in the United States are native. So I just wanted to make that point at the very beginning, so that when I talk about strategic choices, you get a real sense of just what's at stake. Very, very high suicide rates, high infant mortality, very, very high death rates from all sorts of things, high imprisonment rates, incarceration rates through the roof, really. So I'll just show you a few minutes of this so that you get a sense of the poverty I'm talking about, which hasn't significantly been changed by the casino culture that's grown up since the early 90s. That money has gone largely to just a few tribes and just a few key people within those tribes. So this poverty story is still the main story.
Native Americans in the United States are working to make themselves politically powerful and economically independent. Indian land has vast natural resources, and some areas have profited from casinos and other developments.
But many of the native communities remain among the poorest in the United States, afflicted by high rates of unemployment, alcoholism and suicide. In the second of his special reports, John Cookson visited the Native American reservation at Pine Ridge in the midwestern state of South Dakota.
The traditional teepees and campfires have long gone. This is how the Lakota Sioux Indians live now. Many families have only recently got mains electricity and are still without what the rest of America would regard as normal. To me, life seems a bit tough.
Oh yeah, I just have like cold water.
Extreme poverty drives to the despair here. Pine Ridge has the highest teenage suicide rate in the US, and life expectancy is just 50, the lowest in the Western world apart from Haiti. Poverty leads to alcohol abuse, which leads to other social problems like domestic violence.
Help me out, Justin.
I came across an extraordinary scene of a Lakota family pushing a car with no petrol, but with a TV on the back seat.
Why are we going to the pawn shop? I'm going to the pawn shop because I want to hook that TV right there to get us something to eat at Covered Wagon in Gordon.
This is a tragedy, Justin.
It ain't a tragedy to me.
It's not a tragedy.
It's everyday life to a Lakota.
Alcoholism with its roots in the despair of poverty pervades Pine Ridge.
But I used to kill myself
Why do you want to kill yourself?
because of my brother's life.
Because your brother died. Many Native Americans believe there's a white-led conspiracy to keep them poor and to wipe them out. Community leader Paul Little keeps a treasured painting, ironically called The End of the Trail.
Oh yeah, there's a conspiracy probably to do that. You look at President Bush and, you know, and all the billions of dollars that he's spending in Iraq, when he should take care of our own country.
So, just in case, kind of lost now, hang on, well here we go. Just in case you don't know that kind of story and you're wondering where I'm coming from, it's not really from Indians are environmental heroes or some kind of new age hippie thing. I'm more interested in this history of colonialism and then the realities of what, because colonialism is not pretty, and you know, often, although there's this the consolation of culture is often given to groups that have been colonized. They're deemed to have more culture than mainstream settler communities. actually the truth is more like this. It's domestic violence, it's the legacy of alcoholism that comes with having your culture destroyed. That is the larger, bigger picture, and it's little kids not having somewhere to sleep or running water like on Pine Ridge, or just having cold water, not hot and cold. I mean, and this is the case throughout many reservations, not just there. So just so you get the sense of what female leadership means in that larger Native context. So here's a picture of me with LaDonna, and in some ways I do consider her a political genius. I think she's absolutely fascinating what she's managed to do and what she's managed to retain culturally, and the way she thinks, which is over multiple centuries. She thinks as a political leader. There's an Iroquois saying that one should think 7 generations hence, and she's definitely a political leader who does think in those very long time scales, whereas we're a culture to think in 4-year presidential terms, or however it's worked out in the UK, but there is not that long intergenerational care that is embedded in many Native communities. So, as you said at the beginning, this project grew out of a British Academy grant and mid-career fellowship, which I strongly recommend if you can swing one. They're very useful. And the larger book that this LaDonna piece is within is called The American Presidency and Tribal Diplomacy in the 20th Century. So I'm looking at really how various leaders, not just females, have related to the executive and the often guys closest to the president. And in a way I'm making use of an untapped resource, because there's lots of letters, transcripts, archives between presidents and Native peoples that just aren't looked at, and certainly not studied in serious analytical depth, and certainly not looked at as monograph length things. And if that is a lesson really for grant bodies, I think they quite like things like that are just not looked at, because you can always make the clear case that it's new because it just hasn't been done. And I think it's quite important really that this stuff gets looked at, because I think presidents spent a far disproportionate amount of time dealing with Indian issues, but it's not really studied by conventional presidential studies historians. They're just not so interested. Why does it matter? Well, in 1953, a famous jurist and specialist in Native American stuff in law said, Felix Cohen, he said, "Our treatment of Indians, even more than our treatment of other minorities, reflects the rise and fall of our democratic faith." So he compared Native Americans to the canary in the mine, that however they're treated is somehow a barometer of how democracy, how healthy it is, how it's working within any given presidency. And I think he was absolutely right, and that's why, and he compared the same Native Americans to the Jews in Germany. He says the Indian marks the shift from fresh air to poison gas in our political atmosphere. So what I'm saying is, even though Indian numbers might be small in relation to overall American population, their former relations as quasi-sovereign entities, depending on your political outlook, or as they're known within the Supreme Court, domestic dependent nations, which is a kind of oxymoron, but it's the term used. I think they're deeply revealing those relationships of much larger forces, and they produce very interesting readings, new readings of the presidents themselves. And certainly you look at Nixon much differently when you look at him through the lens of Indian relations. Also, new things come out of this about international diplomacy, about propaganda, especially in the First and Second World Wars. You get new looks, new ways of looking at the Cold War at home and the uses of Indians as cultural capital between nations. So you get quite interesting things come out there. And you get a lot of interesting stuff about Indian civil rights and how that relates to other civil rights movements. There's new things get generated when you look in the archives. Even archives like the Nixon archives, which are heavily mediated and controlled by the Nixon Nixon himself and subsequently by those in charge of his legacy. The main thing is people like LaDonna start to come out of the historical mist, and you start to see how important they were in their own world. Another bigger, larger thing is how all of this relates to the field of research that's all about strategy and strategic thinking, which I find quite interesting. Which I suppose, given what we were saying earlier before the talk started, is also, along with the presidency, I suppose, a traditionally male area of concern. So I quite like that this research ties a minority to mainstream concerns like the presidency and ideas of strategy. I think that's quite useful and generative when you do things like that. So there's a recent very good book by Lawrence Freeman called Strategy, a History, and I think this research will do interesting things in terms of his arguments, because this, I suppose, is an asymmetrical relationship. You know, you have natives who have very little power, considering native numbers were 250,000 in 1900, you know, from arguably 7 to 9 million in 1492 within the boundaries of the United States and Canada. So, you know, you're really talking about a heavily subjugated population. So strategically, how do they rebuild themselves? If Friedman comes basically to the conclusion when he looks at strategy that deception, coalition formation, and the instrumental use of violence are what works historically. That's, if I was to sum up the guy's whole book, that would be his argument. And he looks in particular at a book that came out in 1982 called Chimpanzee Politics by Franz de Waal, and he looked at a certain zoo, and he argued really that strategic thinking's older than humanity itself, that it goes right back to our chimp ancestors. He looked at very careful social maneuverings going on amongst chimps. One chimp, for example, deliberately mating with a female in front of the dominant chimp, and getting other females to do the same with other males in order to deflate the status of the dominant male, and then grooming with other females and grooming their children and getting them to go onto his side. And the core elements of the strategic activity that Duval saw in chimps were the ability to recognize each other individually, to perceive social relationships, and to form these coalitions. That was the key thing. And also to be able to break up other people's coalitions. So Friedman's used this strategic thinking and understanding that's embedded in chimp psychology and taken it through the history of mankind. And it's very interesting when you apply this to the 60s and you apply it to how various subordinate nations, like say the Comanche or other native tribes, relate to people like the president. It has interesting things happen, and it's very interesting to fit this kind of strategic response to power that's played out over centuries with a consciousness that you can see is active over centuries. It's interesting to look at that compared to other forms of strategic play, which are often in much shorter timescales. So interesting stuff happens. One of the problems with looking at it, though, is we have a fairly limited vocabulary in the West for looking at asymmetrical strategic power relations. I mean, we have the David and Goliath story from the Hebrew Bible, and that's deemed to be paradigmatic. We also have in ancient Greek thinking Homer's distinction between forms of strategic thinking between BA and Mete. BA seeks victory physically, the second seeks victory through the mind. One's reliant on being strong, the other on being smart. One depends on courage, the other on imagination. And one's prepared to fall with honor, and the other to survive with deception. Now, where you might think does LaDonna Harris's work in the 60s female civil rights protests and other strategic bureaucratic work that they're doing, where does it fit into all of this? And I think that the issue of deception is a very interesting one. If you go back to some of the foundational books, like in the Chinese tradition, Sun Tzu, who wrote The Act of War in circa 500 BCE, he said all warfare is based on deception. And that has its roots in a Chinese concept called Zi, which is all about wisdom, and it's the way that the weak can extract power from the strong. And there's a whole Chinese tradition that's in many ways more generative when we're looking at asymmetrical power relations than any necessary Western tradition. Although Friedman does talk about what he calls strategy from below, how you can wrest power from elites. Now the thinking when LaDonna was working was very much, you're laughing, you've heard of this, is Saul Alinsky, and he wrote this famous book called Rules for Radicals in 1971, and given that you know it, I'll just rattle through it really quickly. And his thinking was in many ways very Sun Tzu. It was very much deception as a strategic choice. First thing you do is persuade your enemy you're bigger than you really are. Stay close to the comfort zone of your own people and outside the comfort zone of your opponent to cause, as he put it, confusion, fear and retreat. Use your opponent's own rule book against him. And perhaps no nation on earth has a more complex rule book than the United States. It's literally a country run by a book in a way, Use ridicule against man's most potent weapon, which is certainly done. One of the interesting things about Native American protests in the 60s is its humour. It's irony, sarcasm is used, so that there isn't the same earnestness that you get with the Black Power movement or even the Black Civil Rights movement. You often get laughter as one of the key weapons. Another one is Alinsky made the point that a very good tactic is one that you yourself enjoy and your people enjoy doing. So don't take them out of their comfort zone, get them to do something they want to do anyway, in order to attack power. Well, having given this intellectual kind of context for this work, let's get down to the power that LaDonna was trying to wrestle with. And he's probably the most laughed at president in history, I would suggest, apart from maybe Hubert Humphrey. And there's one of the wonderful, this is actually pro-Nixon, this button. And it's almost like Nixon goes beyond humour. He's beyond parody at a certain point. And Nixon himself says such unbelievable things that it's in a way he doesn't need to be sent up. You probably have heard of the Nixon tapes. Well, here's Nixon on various ethnic groups, nicely hanging himself. But you got to remember that he was just being paradigmatic of the types who elected him, of the moral majority that he spoke to. And in many ways he was more liberal than they were. But anyway, here he is on blacks. Some of them are smart. They have to bring in bread. And the Irish? I don't know if you agree with that, Sinead, but the Italians are wonderful people, but the Jews, this is probably the worst.
And then there was this, about his own national security advisor, Henry Kissinger. We have long known Nixon had been.
So that gives you a sense of the kinds of things that Nixon would say. So it's clearly a problematic president. If you were at the other seminar, in the American History seminar, I think, and then someone was giving a talk on Nixon, you'd still get a degree of confusion. certainly now. He's the 37th president, serves from 69 to 74. Here's a little sample of what various historians say about him. James McGregor Burns said of Nixon, "How can one evaluate such an idiosyncratic president, so brilliant and so morally lacking?" And if you read one of those books in front of you, this is by one of his dear colleagues, he's a lawyer who worked with him, you can kind of see a real moral ambivalence. That's Len Garment's book. There's a real kind of, how can I put it, they're at ease with certain moral issues that perhaps you or I would find more black and white. Ambrose said Nixon wanted to be judged by what he accomplished. What he will be remembered for is the nightmare he put the country through in his second term and for his resignation. Irwin Gelwin chronicled Nixon's congressional career, suggests he was remarkable among his congressional peers, a success story in a troubled era, one who steered a sensible anti-communist course against the excess of McCarthy. Jonathan Aiken, who fascinatingly is obsessed with Nixon, he said Nixon, both as a man and a statesman, has been excessively maligned for his faults and inadequately recognised for his virtues, which actually, I have to say, I would agree with. According to his biographer, Herbert Parmet, he said Nixon's role was to steer the Republican Party along a middle course, somewhere between the competitive impulses of the Rockefellers, the Goldwaters and the Reagans. Nixon himself felt that his raison d'etre, his point for being alive, was foreign policy. He actually said he'd do anything to be able to make an impact in foreign policy, short of psychotherapy, which was his greatest fear. But he really felt that, you know, foreign policy was where he was at. And I think there's a lot to be said that, you know, if you take Vietnam out of the equation, he actually does a lot in foreign policy that maybe saved lives ultimately. In saying all of this, I think that the general thinking on Nixon is negative, if you can say generalities at all. And I think a lot of people are still living with the ideas about Nixon that historian Keith Olson came up with, and he says that what Nixon did was take away fundamentally our trust in American government, and this was because of Vietnam, because of Watergate. And Olson says it's not until 9/11 and President Bush that really the presidency as an executive entity is able to wrest back some of the presidential power that Nixon squandered. So I mean, that I think a lot of people, you know, if they're plotting a chart of presidential power over time, Nixon's deemed to have damaged the presidency, and a lot of his powers were not redeemed until after 9/11. However, when you're looking at him just from the point of view of Native Americans, or even if you just look at him from the point of view of domestic policies, and in particular the things closest to the hearts of Native peoples like themselves and their land, it's hard to dismiss the achievements of the Nixon administration. You got to credit them with the passage and enforcement of the environmental and regulatory legislation of the time. After all, it was Nixon who created the Environmental Protection Agency, and he enforced legislation such as the 1973 Endangered Species Act. Now, you could actually make a case that Nixon did more for the environment than Obama has done so far, which is a remarkable thing to say, I think, for many of us who've lived through the Obama phenomena. In saying that, most Native Americanists, people who write about Native America, whether they're actually tribal or they're not, generally look negatively on Nixon. Forbes wrote Native Americans and Nixon 1981, and he saw them negatively. I personally wouldn't go as far as people like Hoff and Aiken, who present Nixon as a secret liberal. I think that's going too far. But I do think that my research has brought up key things. One, he had a Native American Indian mentor who meant a lot to him. And you can't say that about any other president. That was his baseball coach who, he actually spent time with him and listened to him throughout his life. Nixon also respected native treaties, and he returned the sacred Blue Lake, deemed to be the capital of Native America, back to the Taos Indians in 1970. And LaDonna is the key player, one of the very key players, making that happen. I'm going to talk some more about that in a minute. He also rejects forced tribal termination and instead enshrines the new concept, which we're still living with, called tribal self-determination. And even though the roots of self-determination as Indian policy lie with the Democratic Party programs in the 60s, it was Nixon from the very beginning of his campaign who recognized the unique political relationship between Indians and the federal government. He's the first president in the 20th century to emphasize the binding nature of treaties. And perhaps if we look at this over centuries, that will be seen as an absolutely pivotal executive shift. Emphasizes self-rule through recommending codified procedures whereby tribes can negotiate with the federal government and get tribal control of federal programs. He advocates an Indian Finance Act. He opens the door for Indian participation in the federal policy-making process. And it's under Nixon you get preferential hiring of natives within the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And not least, the federal Indian budget more than doubles during his tenure. He recognizes the successful policy initiatives that he wants to put through need executive and Congress to cooperate, and this is how he gets things done. Things like the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975. So this is research that does help to reevaluate Nixon. It doesn't necessarily say he's a secret liberal, because arguably natives were a good bone to throw to the larger young generation who wanted civil rights change. This is a small population, it's one he can be seen to be efficacious with, and it's not politically dangerous. So you can take a more cynical look at what Nixon's doing and see it as a bone that's thrown. But you also cannot deny the unique nature of what he achieves. And it depends how you want to read it. One of the things I'll be doing is fitting this into the history of native patriotism and the whole notion of how governments relate to Indians. Books like Rockwell's Indian Affairs and the Administrative State in the 19th Century, which Cambridge brought out in 2010. I want to do something analogous for the 20th century. Just to show you a picture, this is Blue Lake that gets returned. No one very much sees this because now it's heavily protected. One of the most beautiful places on earth, and a place of great spiritual power, or deemed to have. As I was saying earlier, we've got to look at things like this the way many native leaders urge us to look at it, as part of a centuries-long story. I can't tell you how significant it is to get back land, for the arrow to go this way instead of that way. The larger story has been the loss of land, of resources, of power and agency. So LaDonna being key to that arrow changing and setting precedent for it changing is extremely significant. And I would urge you to look at native peoples as peoples who have suffered enormous demographic loss. It's a story of loss played out over generations. So there's a Cherokee demographer, if you're interested in numbers, and I've written about this myself. He argued that there were, say, 5 million in the United States, plus 2 million in Alaska, Canada and Greenland in 1492. And then you end up with just 250,000 in 1900. So where did they go? Some people have much larger figures, but you are talking about, I say to my students, it's the equivalent of the Martians landing. And within a couple of generations, really, or 10 generations, we have nothing. Our numbers are so thinned that and all our political structures are gone. Our White House is gone, or whatever, our St. Paul's Cathedral, whatever you would claim to be the citadel of our culture, is gone. So to finally reverse these trends is really significant. Also, I think significant that this is happening in the 70s is that I think our notions of protest, native protests in this period are very male. They're this kind of the young brave look, and it's also the type of stuff that was on everyone's television at night. It was people being physically protesting and appealing to white America. LaDonna's doing something completely different. She's actually near real power, and she's setting up bureaucratic processes. She's doing the opposite of this male thing, if you want to see it that way. She's putting herself last and putting the principle first. So she's creating committees that customarily have a Native American at their core, rather than putting herself forward in order to achieve set aim, which has always been the big critique of guys like this. This is the Wounded Knee protest in 1973 with Russell Means, Dennis Banks. This is very much the story you've heard about. She's the story you haven't, that arguably is more significant over time, because hers is a legacy that's slow burning. You could say that this is a legacy that peaked and was contained in the 70s. Also, it's not, as I say, it's not telegenic what she's doing. Serving on committees, creating coalitions, thinking strategically over multiple generations. None of this lends itself to visual representation. So I think it's a different way of looking at it. Now, to get to the gender issue, given this is a gender seminar, I probably should do. I think the other thing that this research does is bring to the fore the female nature of leadership in Native America. These are Iroquois clan mothers. The Iroquois are the group that white people probably first encountered, other than those in the small islands. They're the people of the northeastern United States who gradually get pushed west as white people push west. And one of the problems of the cultural incomprehension that happened when Euro-Americans came to settle in the United States is they don't know how to politically deal with leadership that is female. They don't know how to deal with cultures where descent is reckoned through the female line, as it is of the Iroquois. Cultures that are matrifocal or matrilineal, they just do not know how to deal with this, and often say, take me to your leader, who they expect to be male, because this is the European paradigm. So if you look at the early documents, you often get this stress between actual leadership and what Europeans are prepared to recognize as leadership. And this is, I think, a story that hasn't been adequately told, or told in a way that's ever likely to sell enough so that it gets into people's consciousness. It's just, I think the whole female gender Native American thing has just not been discussed enough, in my opinion. And I think if you ever visit with Native people, you'll probably notice this just in terms of how many Native women in leadership positions act. Because we're walking around probably with names that are passed down through the male line. I'm Porter because of Porter male thing. And when you have a culture where property and power and naming all goes through the female line, you find, I suppose, entrenched power culturally is female, which is a completely different paradigm. I remember one of the first Iroquois female leaders I met, I was very shocked at how she used her body, because we're often trained to cross our legs and take up as little space as possible and protect our sexual parts and so on, where we were not even aware we're doing it. But she sat and used the room the way a extremely rich, powerful male would do, and it was quite shocking. It was immediate, gave you immediate point of access to a completely different way of being. So I'll just read you a bit from George Canentio from 2000, who's speaking about, is native and is speaking about this difference. He said, "In our society, women are the center of all things. This is as true now as it was then, but it's true in different ways. Nature, we believe, has given woman the ability to create. Therefore, it's only natural that women be in positions of power. We traced our clans through women. A child born into the world assumed the clan membership of its mother. Our young women were expected to be physically strong. Since the Iroquois were absolutely dependent upon the crops they grew, whoever controlled this vital activity wielded great power within our communities. It was our belief that since women were the givers of life, they naturally regulated the feeding of our people. In all countries, real wealth stems from the control of land and its resources. Our Iroquois philosophers knew this as well as we know natural law." Blah, 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 blah. "Our leaders were selected by a caucus of women before the appointments were subject to popular review. Our traditional governments are composed of an equal number of men and women. The men are chiefs and the women clan mothers. As leaders, the women closely monitor the actions of the men and retain the right to veto any law they deem inappropriate." So the clan mothers are the actual power. If you want to talk about where the buck stops, it's with the clan mothers, and they're quite, most powerful nation in the whole, ultimately confederacy in the whole northeastern region. "Our women not only hold the reins of political and economic power, they also have the right to determine all issues involving the taking of human life. Declarations of war had to be approved by the women, while treaties of peace were subject to their deliberations." Now, part of the spiritual, social, cultural, military battle between Europeans and natives was to destroy all those links that were female-centered. And it's done reasonably successfully. If you want to go back a bit further, go back to, say, Horatio Hale, who wrote the Iroquois Book of Rights in 1883. He said, "The complete equality of the sexes in social estimation and influence is apparent in all the narratives of the early missionaries, who were the best possible judges on this point. Casual observers have been misled by the absence of those artificial expressions of courtesy which have descended to us from the time of chivalry, and which, however gracious and pleasing to witness, are, after all, merely signs of condescension and protection from the strong to the weak. The Iroquois does not give up his seat to a woman or yield her precedence on leaving a room, but he secures in her the possession of her property. He recognizes her right to the children she has borne, and he submits to her decision in the choice of his future rulers." So what I'm saying is, LaDonna is not really surprising. And when we look to Native women and we find key forms of leadership, we shouldn't be surprised. However, it very often doesn't follow the paradigm that maybe in the West female agency has followed. I mean, from your own research, Sinead, you will know that feminist writers have often been upset with 60s Native protesting women because they were less interested in women's rights than they were in Native civil rights protests. Much more interested in feeding their kids, getting roads, running water, all of that, than they were in asserting a notion of female rights. And it's possibly because they see themselves as leaders first and women way lower in whatever pecking order. Here's an example of contemporary female leadership. Deborah Parker, vice chairwoman of the Tulalip tribes, Washington State, is her speaking to Congress very recently. And this is interesting. This is Diane Humatiwa, who's Hopi. She was nominated by President Barack Obama to serve for the U.S. District Court for Arizona, and that would make her the first Native American in the federal judiciary, which is a very big deal. The stereotype is that black Americans put their kids into sociology, intellectual children. This has been it's been discussed. You have Du Bois, you have that whole intellectual history, and it's said that Native intellectuals, certainly since the 60s and since the Second World War, it's all been about the law. It's all been about treaties. It's all been about asserting sovereignty through the law, that emancipation is going to come from that. And there does seem to be this interesting phenomena whereby natives and the law seem to go very well together, not surprisingly, I think, given their history. So just to end, how long would you like me to speak for before I end?
As long as you want.
Alright, I'll just speak for about 5 minutes. This is LaDonna in her traditional clothing, which she now wants to dress more in and become more of a medicine woman. She thinks she's done enough interaction with people, which I always think is great. It's a great notion that you would get to a certain point in your life and you say, you know what, I've spoken enough, I'm just going to go into my spiritual world. Anyway, Blue Lake, her helping to get Blue Lake back for the Taos people, her history generally, I think, is a very useful example of how relationships between administrations and Indian peoples were not always top down. And that's quite important in the 20th century. Blue Lake, the Indian capital of the world, gets returned in 1970. She's key to the whole process. She's the senator's wife of Fred Harris, and she is absolutely pivotal in reversing the pre-New Deal narrative of American governmental segregation of Indian land. So she uses her contacts and her knowledge of the political process to achieve this. She has the phone number of everybody. She knows everybody from presidents down. And she gets this lake back. It's in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains of New Mexico. And she creates a series of organizations that advance Indian concerns. She's president of a still going national tribal organization, Americans for Indian Opportunity. She also founded Oklahomans for Indian Opportunity in 1965. She's active in Nixon's National Council for Indian Opportunity. She's the first congressional wife to testify before Congress. She served on scores of federal committees. In fact, LaDonna Harris has discussed Indian affairs with every president since Lyndon Baines Johnson. And like other famous Native activists of the late 20th century, Wilma Mankiller, Harris has an Irish parent, but she identifies primarily as a Comanche. And she's very much acting in the way of Native female leadership, it has to be said. She's very much acting the way Paula Gunn Allen describes how female Native leadership works. Gunn Allen says, for the Indian woman, her destiny is necessarily that of her people, and her sense of herself as a woman is first and foremost prescribed by her tribe. So what would be Comanche traditions, therefore, that she's putting forward? We're talking limited leadership, consensus politics, which is very hard to make work, the emphasis on honour and not shaming each other, public opinion, very, very important, and identity, Comanche identity and many other tribal identities defined by active participation in a community rather than by birth. So that means if you're Johnny Depp or Fred X, if you start being important to a community, then you can be of that community irrespective of your descent. Not that Johnny Depp necessarily isn't Comanche, but you see what I mean. And this is where the whole US governmental emphasis upon blood quantum is, I think, so flawed and negative, not least because if you create a biological, mathematical definition of identity, time is on the bad guy's side, you could say, because intermarriage leads to dilution and so on. It's worth remembering that a sizable portion of what became southwestern Oklahoma had included the Kiowa, Comanche and Apache reservation until the US government opened the land to white homesteaders in 1901. just 6 years before Oklahoma got statehood. And you've only got 5,500 Kiowa, Comanche and Apache Indians living in southwest Oklahoma in 1931 when Harris is born. So this is a leader of a massively depleted population, and I think we have to see her in that way. And I think, just to go back to what I was saying about lawyers, one of the interesting things about Nixon, who's a lawyer, and that guy Len Garment, who's a lawyer, is one thing they're very clear about is the law is what does most for poor people, and I think that's refreshingly honest of them. It's one of the reasons Len Garment doesn't get in charge of the Office for Economic Opportunity, because he's much less interested in welfare payments and much more interested in legal fundamental change, which of course scared the horses significantly. LaDonna does other things, like she helps the Menominee tribe get back their status as a federal entity. There's a policy that Nixon overturns, which is called termination, scarily, and it's about terminating the federal relationship of welfare largely between tribes and the federal government, and LaDonna helps the Menominee reverse this. And eventually she really manages to get Blue Lake, which comes along with 48,000 acres back, and it's she uses religion and a coalition of ideas to get it done. So just to end, what have we learnt? What can you learn from LaDonna Harris and her behaviour in the 60s? And this comes from her and from me and from meeting with her, interviewing her, looking at her papers and thinking it through. First thing is the importance of the creation and maintenance of a repository of institutional knowledge and memory about processes of change. One of the great things she encourages is a sense that Indians are going to be there for a long time, but administrations change arguably within 4 years, and people change very quickly within positions of power. So memory is absolutely key. You've got Indian representatives dealing with almost constantly shifting governmental targets, initiatives, personnel. So a discrete Indian record of experience, achievement and hazard was an essential aid to success across administrations. And that's something she stressed at great length to me, that if you are a small nation dealing with entrenched power, your memory has to be much better than theirs. And the importance of keeping records and having an institutional memory. Another thing that's very important is it's very effective to pursue multiple avenues for redress all at once through conduits that do not specifically concern minority rights. She gets Blue Lake back largely through making a religious freedom argument, and that religious freedom argument has grown since then, such that Native peoples in many states through federal mandate can practice their religion even if it contradicts certain drug laws. For example, the use of peyote within prison, sweat lodges within prison, being allowed to do this, etc. LaDonna claims that Blue Lake is a spiritually significant place. So she's not asking for the administratively impossible, which is give us back the land you stole and swindled away from us by treaty. She's saying this is religiously significant, therefore it must come under the rubric and thinking that you're applying to the whole nation in terms of religious freedom. I think the most successful Indian campaigners took a holistic approach to and accessed multiple White House initiatives. For her it was the mental health agenda, women's rights, childhood health, states' rights, all simultaneously. And presidential records teem with requests for what was considered the administratively impossible, as I've said, give us back our land, give us fundamental redress for loss of resources. But what real success for small nations, it would seem, comes from taking this deeply strategic, flexible, long-term approach that LaDonna is putting forward. Other important thing is goal flexibility. That's key. Using arguments strategically so as to build bipartisan support. Blue Lake supported by each side, Democrats, Republicans, which is amazing. Indian diplomats worked hard to insert themselves into, for example, debates about energy policy, an issue that they knew would transcend specific administrations. Thinking far forward and also being very flexible about what your goals may be in any given time. Other big thing, importance of the personal. President Nixon's lifelong mentor was a sporting great of Whittier College, California, named Wallace Newman, who was native. And I visited Whittier and Newman's lay biographer. He's a lovely, very diligent person, and he's got a lot of interesting research on Nixon that has never really been given scholarly attention, which I'm going to try and do for him with him. The other thing is the power of innovative forms of leadership. Harris created new social networks and relationships. She got Indians included in the War on Poverty initiative. This paved the way ultimately for government-to-government relationships between tribal nations and the US government. She created sustainable roles rather than advanced her own power. So she got Indian desks, as she put it, created in federal agencies. Oklahomans for Indian Opportunity, Americans for Indian Opportunity, the Council for Energy Resource Tribes, the National Indian Business Association. She creates entities that will survive beyond her and that have agendas that are beyond her purview necessarily. And she also does a lot of work to enshrine the new language. There's a book in Native Studies called Reinventing the Enemy's Language and how important this is. So she enshrines self-determination as a term. And she's always putting forward Comanche values. She says, relationships among men, women and children are based on harmony. Women and children are equal partners to men in Comanche culture. She's very much, I think, of today when you have people like Linda Tahiwe Smith writing decolonizing methodologies. She's very much doing that cleansing process of getting settler thinking and settler ways of being out of native consciousness. Now, there's a movie now being made about LaDonna, which I'll just show you briefly, which was crowd-sponsored. And it gives you a sense of her charm. I'll not show you the sound on that isn't very. There she is.
We're made to feel this discomfort both through the educational system, religious institutions, and other things that really did psychologically harm the Comanche and Indian people.
In those days, Indians were seen as derelicts and drunks, or as unfortunate wretches that had not.
We'll leave that because you can't really hear it.
Messages of a culture that was holding them back.
They were so belittling. It made me feel so ugly and talked about my folks. That brings back more things.
Another thing, she's not scared of being upset. She often speaks of great sorrow just at the whole situation that she's found herself in and her people in. She's quite emotional, really, which is unusual in leadership as well. This is Nixon rhapsodying about his Indian football coach and how times have changed and how the values that he got from this Indian football coach really informed his whole life, for good or bad. I hope the volume on this is adequate so as you can hear it.
I would say the reason the family was happy was
we've lost it, haven't we? It's a pity. I don't know how we could.
Deeply devoted to their children.
I can paraphrase it for you. He has a pretty rough childhood. I don't mean to make you feel sorry for Nixon, but he did have a very grim childhood with deaths in the family and so on. He grows up with this terrific work ethic, absolutely amazing work ethic, and clear, maybe binary sense of right and wrong. And one of the things he learns from this native football coach, from Wallace Newman, is the power of getting back up when you've been knocked down and seeing failure or knockbacks or setbacks as being part of your journey. And Nixon, in this little clip, is bemoaning the fact that when he's speaking here in 1968, already he senses that people are just not prepared to try anymore, that they want things on a plate and they're not really understanding how failure is part of the trajectory of success, and they don't understand poverty anymore, and so on. And you can really get a sense of his values, and in a way how very important Newman was to his thinking, for good or ill. But say what you like about Nixon, but he has a lot of charismatic power. And if you go to the Nixon Library, you will find a wonderful set of things you can buy. And they say, what would Nixon do? A bit like, what would Jesus do? And it's a genuine, it's a genuine thing. They really think that were Nixon back, the world would be a much better place, and that he is like Christ. What would Nixon do? And in his presidential library, which is a place as an academic where you're never going to get more attention paid to you, like 3 librarians at any given time, enormously well resourced from the kinds of people who supported the Nixon administration. And Nixon's grave is there, and he's buried there with his wife, and his childhood home is there as well in California. And it's an absolutely beautiful, beautiful place, should you ever wish to visit.